In this lecture, we're going to talk about the if function and Boolean functions. The if function checks to see if a condition is true or false. If the condition is true, one thing happens, otherwise, another thing happens. So you can think of it like this. If this is true, do this, else do this. Syntax equals if, left parenthesis, logical test, comma, value of true, comma, value of false. Notice the value of false argument is in brackets, meaning it is optional. If you leave off that argument, then if your test is false, it will actually display the value false. And that is not a good way to use this if, so do not use it this way. You'll be counted off, and we will show you a better way if you want to display true or false in your cell. And again, the logical test, it must evaluate to a true or a false. Let's talk about the criteria syntax. If the criteria that you are using is a number, then you just type the number in with the argument. So for example, equals if B3 greater than or equal to 6. So it says if B3 is greater than or equal to 6, if that's true, comma, do this, else do this. Let's say you are using text as your criteria. You always surround text in quotes. If B3 is not equal to USA, comma, do this, else do this. Notice it's the text, so you have to put quotes around it. So basically any non-numeric value, except for a cell reference, you have to put quotes around it. And that's not just true for criteria, it's true for any number or any text you use in any function. So if you're using a number in any function, you're just going to put the number. If you're using text or non-numeric data, except for a cell reference in any function, you're going to put quotes around it. And then if you have a cell reference as a criteria, then you just type in the cell. If B3 equals B5, do this, else do this. Let's look at a few examples. At the top of the screen, I just have a list of USB drives, and they're 32 gig, and I'm deciding if I'm going to purchase them or not. My max price that I want to pay for these is $30. I have the types of USB drives, the store, the price of each. The other three columns I am going to calculate myself. So if you look down in cell D3, it says if C3 is less than or equal to $1, $1 is the max price. If it's less than or equal, comma, I'm going to display within budget. Else, I'm going to display too expensive. I put the $sign in front of the 1 because I don't want that 1 to change. Now I don't want the E to change either, but because we're copying it down, that E is not going to change anyway. The cell reference for the E will only change if you copy it to the next column. Here's another example. In cell E3, I'm determining whether it's a preferred store or not. And as you can see, I'm saying my preferred store is Staples. Equals B3, or equals if B3 equals Staples, that's in quotes, comma, preferred store, comma, not preferred. And they're in quotes because they're non-numeric. I don't have to have any $signs because I need those cell references to change. And then finally, remaining dollars. Okay, that means that if I am within budget and I buy this flash drive, if my maximum price, I have $30 in my pocket, what am I going to have left? So I put here equals if C3 is less than or equal to $1. Again, the $sign because we're copying it down. We don't want to change it. So, and we didn't put if C3 is less than or equal to 30. We just put the cell reference, comma, $1 minus C3. So we're subtracting the money that we have in our pocket. We're taking that money, subtracting minus the price, and getting the remaining amount. Otherwise, we're putting cell D3. And cell D3 has the words too expensive or within budget. Now let's talk about a variation of the if, the nested if. You can think of it like this. If this is true, comma, do this, comma, else, if this is true, comma, do this, else, do this. And you can nest this up to 7 times, so you can have up to 7 ifs in this statement. That is not a preferred way to use the if statement. If you get up to 7, I don't know, if you get up to probably 4 ifs, you might want to look at another way to do it. You might want to use a reference function, and we're going to talk about those in a later lecture. Here's the syntax. Oh, basically I don't have the syntax here, I apologize. We saw the syntax of the basic if function, which would be the same syntax as the nested if, only we would have an if this, do this, etc. So here we think of it this way, equals if this equals true, comma, do this, comma, else if this equals true, comma, do this, comma, otherwise do this. All right, let's take a look at an example. We have some students here and we have their English grade, and we want to determine in cell B6 the student who had the highest score. So down in cell B6 on the bottom we say equals if B2 equals max B2 colon B5, then comma A2. So if James Brown has the highest score, we're going to display him, comma if B3 equals max B2 colon B5, comma A3. We'll display Sam Elliott. Comma if B4 equals max B2 colon B5, then we will display David Byrne. If none of those check out, then by default we know that it's Annie Lennox, so we will display cell A5. Notice I have these embedded, and when I do, you have the open braces or parentheses and the end brace parentheses have to match. So we have the if statement starts out with the parenthesis. Within that if statement we have the max function. The max function begins with a parenthesis and ends with a parenthesis. Notice where they're placed. We have another if function with a left parenthesis. Within that if function we have the max function. Max begins with a parenthesis and ends with a parenthesis. We have the final if statement that begins with a parenthesis. We have the other max statement, begins with a parenthesis and ends with a parenthesis. And then at the very end of the if statement we have 3 parentheses, because that closes out every if. We have 3 ifs, so we have 3 parentheses or closing parentheses at the end. Where you place these parentheses matters. Here's an example of an if with a range. I have a list of current rent prices, and then I have a rent increase. At the top you can see if my rent is between $0 and $700, I'm going to get a 7% increase. If it's between $701 and $1,000, there'll be a 5% increase. If it's greater than 1,000, there's going to be a 3% increase. So look at cell C6 down here where I have the formula. If B6 is greater than 1,000, comma 1 plus D3, so we're going to incorporate the rate increase of 3%. Otherwise, if B6 is greater than 700, we will incorporate the 5%. Otherwise, we will incorporate the 3%, and then we will multiply it. When you have a range, upper to lower or lower to upper, what you can do is start with the highest value and go to the lowest, or start with the lowest value and go to the highest value when you're checking your if. Because when an if finds a true condition, it will do whatever's after the comma, and then it will not continue. So if you notice, if B6 is greater than 1,000, if it's greater than 1,000, it's going to give you 1 plus D3, which will be 1.03, and then it's not going to check anything else in the if statement. So it would take 1.03 and multiply it by B6. Sometimes when we use an if function, we need more than one criteria. When we need more than one criteria, we will use a Boolean function. The Boolean functions that we will look at, the and, the or, and the not. And you see the syntax here. Equals and logical 1, comma, logical 2, comma, ellipsis. Logical 1 is required, logical 2 is not, and you can have many more arguments. This function will return a true or display a true in your cell if all of the arguments evaluate to true. The or function, logical 1, comma, logical 2 in brackets, comma, ellipsis. So the only argument that you need is logical 1, and this function will return a true, or it will display a true in your cell, if at least one of your arguments evaluates to true. The not function has only one argument, and that argument has to evaluate to true or false. So it changes a false to a true and a true to a false. When we're looking at Boolean functions, it's nice to have a truth table. And if you look up here at the top, I have a truth table for an and function. And at the top, I have a truth table for just two arguments. So I have equals and a comma b. So if in row 3, if a evaluates to false and b evaluates to false, then the whole function will evaluate to false. If a evaluates to false and b evaluates to true, the whole function will evaluate to false. And if a is true and b is false, then they will evaluate to false. If a and b are true, then the statement will evaluate to true. So basically, for a and b, it gives you all the scenarios. And for this statement, the and statement, to evaluate to true, all of your arguments must evaluate to true. On the left side, you see some truth tables, an and truth table, and it has 3 arguments. Okay, and you can look here in row 3. So if your argument A, B, and C have false, then your cell will display a false. If you have false, false, true, your cell will display a false. If you have false, true, false, it will display a false. If you have false, true, true, it will display a false. True, false, false displays a false. True, false, true also displays a false. True, true, false, that displays a false. And finally, true, true, true displays a true. What these truth tables are doing is they are evaluating every possible combination of cells A, B, and C, and checking to see how they evaluate. Basically, with the and statement, if you have one argument that evaluates to false, then everything in that function, that whole function, will evaluate to a false, meaning a false will display in your cell. The or function, with the or function, only one argument has to evaluate to true in order for the statement to display or return a true. So here are our truth tables. If we have equals or a comma b, then if a is false and b is false, then the statement will return a false, or a false will display in your cell. If a is false and b is true, you'll display a true. If a is true and b is false, you'll still display a true. If a, b are true, you'll display a true. So notice the only time that function will display a false is when a and b both have a false in them. And likewise, down here, the truth table with an or with 3 arguments. The only time, and again, we put down every possible combination here, and the only time that this statement will evaluate to false is if A, B, and C, all 3 evaluate to false. The truth table for the not function, if you have equals not A, and A is false, it's going to display a true. If you have equals not A in cell A4, and cell A4 is true, it's going to display a false. Let's do some examples. Here I have two spreadsheets. I have a spreadsheet named Scores and a spreadsheet named Statistics. The spreadsheet named Scores is just a view of our subset. So we have a huge amount of information, and I'm just pulling up, I've just copied 3 over so you can look at them. The average test score for all of my students, and again, this is just a sampling, I have a lot more students, but the average test score is a 300. I consider a passing score of 320. I have midterm 1, midterm 2, final, total points, and I'm denoting whether the student is an honor student or not by using the words true or false. Notice the possible points are at the top, so I can use those to calculate grades if I need to. I'm going to use the worksheet Statistics to show you examples of the functions that we've learned so far. All right, the first one. Write a formula in cell Statistics F2 to determine true or false if Led Zeppelin's total score is higher than Rob Thomas's total score. All we have to type in is equals scores E5 greater than scores E6. If you type that into cell F2, you need to look at cell scores E5, which is 300, scores E6, which is 345. So is 300 greater than 345? True or false? If it's a true, it will display a true. If it's false, it will display a false. Next example, write a formula in cell Statistics F3 to determine true or false if Rob Thomas's total score is the maximum in the class. So we're using the max function to get the max score of everyone in the class, and we're comparing it to Rob Thomas's score. If they equal, you'll return a true. If they don't equal, then your cell will display a false. Write a formula in cell Statistics F4 to determine true or false if the average total score of all students is less than 300. We're using the average function to average all the students' scores, and then we put less than 300, which scores B1 has the value 300 in it. If that's true, if the average score is less than scores B1, it's less than 300, it'll display a true. Otherwise, it will display a false in your cell. Here's a little more complicated example. Write a formula in cell Statistics F5 to determine true or false if everyone passed the class. The passing score is 320. So far, what we've looked at are the functions with actually the values true and false in the cells. Now we're checking for an actual value. And the ones previously, I should note, they only had one argument. They were only comparing one criteria. And here we're comparing more. So we're checking to see if everyone passed the class. So we use the AND function. So if scores E5 is greater than or equal to B2, which means this person passed the class, which is Led Zeppelin, then that will return a true. Comma, if scores E6 is greater than or equal to scores B2, that'll be a true. If scores E7 is greater than or equal to scores B2, that will be a true. If all of those arguments, those 3 arguments, evaluate to true, then the statement will evaluate to true, or it will display a true in the cell. Write a formula in Statistics F6 to determine true or false if all the students are honor students. Now, the honor students are denoted in column F of your scores worksheet, and it has the values true and false in them already. So all you have to do is type in equals and scores F5 colon F7. What you don't want to do, you don't want to do this, equals and scores F5 equals true, comma scores F6 equals true, comma scores F7 equals true. You don't have to put the equals true because it is implied that you're checking for true. The cells already have true and false in them. So if the cell has true, if all of those have true, it will display a true. You really don't want to put quotes around the word true and false. True and false are special values to the computer. They're Boolean values, and if you put quotes around the true or false, you may get an unexpected result. What I have found is usually you will get the correct response or the result in the cell where you type that, but if you use that cell to compare any other criteria, you usually get the wrong answer. Next one, write a formula in cell statistics F7 to determine true or false if Led Zeppelin's total score and Rob Thomas's total score is greater than Rascal Flatts' total score. So we're looking here equals and. We're checking Rob Thomas's and Led Zeppelin's. So Rob Thomas, if it's greater than score E7, which is Rascal Flatts' total score, and Led Zeppelin's is greater than Rob's, then it'll display a true. If either of those are false, it will display a false. Here's another one. Write a formula in cell statistics F8 to determine true or false if at least one person passed the class. And you're going to check all 3 students, and if anyone passed the class here, and passing score is 320, which is in cell B2, if anyone passed the class, then this cell in F8 will display a true. Another example, write a formula in cell statistics F9 to determine true or false if at least one person is an honor student. So now we use the OR function. If we wanted to check to make sure every student is an honor student, true or false, we use the AND, but we're only checking for at least one person, so we're using the OR. Write a formula in cell statistics F10 to determine true or false if Led Zeppelin is not an honor student. Well, in scores F5, it already tells us if he's an honor student. So in statistics F10, the easiest thing for me to do is just to type equals not scores F5. Write a formula in cell statistics F11 to determine true or false if none of the students are honor students. Anytime you see the word none of, you're going to want to use the not or construct. What happens is you have the OR function. Remember, the not function only has one argument. In this case, the argument is another function. What the OR function does is it's going to tell you if at least one person is an honor student. So if one person is an honor student, that OR statement is going to evaluate to true. The not statement will negate it. Not true is false, because you're checking to see if none of the students are honor students. You could also use equals not F6 because we have already determined the OR function. We've used that in cell F6, so we can just build on other cells. That's the best way to do things if you can. Another possible answer, you could say equals and not scores F3, comma, not scores F4, comma, not scores F5. You could also say equals and scores F3 equals false, comma, scores F4 equals false, comma, scores F5 equals false. Not as efficient as what you see in the cell F11 at the top. The nice thing about this function with the range is, remember, if we add rows, it will adjust the function. But if we use the and not at the bottom, it's not going to adjust that. So we will leave off a score when we're checking. The not F6 is going to be fine because you will be using the OR function in the previous cell, so it will always change. Okay, here's an example of another not OR function. Write a formula in cell statistics F12 to determine true or false if none of the students pass the course. Well, this time the values in the cells don't have true or false. They have actual values themselves. If you're using true and false, you can use a range. You know, if you have true and false in your cells already that you are evaluating. But if you don't, if you're using any other value, you have to separate them one by one by one. So we do equals not or, scores E5 is less than scores B2, etc. If there's at least one true in that scenario, then it will evaluate to true, and not true is false. That's how you check to see if none of the students pass the course. You can also build on another cell that already has the OR in it, which is cell F5, so equals not F5. Here's another scenario. Write a formula in cell statistics F13 to determine true or false if only Led Zeppelin passed the course. Anytime you see the word only, you want to use the construct and, not, or. The first thing you're going to check is to make sure that Led Zeppelin did pass the course. So the and scores E5 greater than or equal to scores B2, we're checking to see if he passed the course. If he didn't pass the course, then we don't want to check anything else. So you have really two arguments in the and function. You have the scores E5 greater than or equal to scores B2, and then you have the not or statement. Those are two arguments for the and function. So the first argument in the and function checks to see if he passed the course. If he did, we want to make sure that no one else did, and that's what the not or is doing. So if he passed the course and anyone else did, then the statement is false because he is not the only one who passed the course. But if he did pass the course and everyone else did not, the statement will evaluate to true. Another answer you can use is the one at the bottom. The first argument will check to see if Led Zeppelin passed the course, and the other one's going to see if no one else did. Remember, in F5 we already checked that, so it'll be very easy to use this formula. Alright, here's another example. Write a formula in cell statistics F14 to determine true or false if Rob Thomas's score is at least 15 points higher than Rascal Flatts' score. Scores E6 greater than scores E7 plus 15. We're going to add 15 to Led Zeppelin's score, and we will check that against Rascal Flatts. Alright, now we're going to use another worksheet. We're going to use the same old worksheet scores, but we're going to use another worksheet called New Stats to demonstrate the if function. Write a formula in cell New Stats F2 to determine if everyone passed the course. If they pass the course, you want to display the text everyone. Otherwise, you want to display the text not everyone. And there's the syntax. We have equal if and. The and function is the first argument in the if function, and it's going to check to see if everyone passed the course. If everyone passed the course, then that criteria will evaluate to true, so it will display everyone. Otherwise, it's going to display not everyone. Next one, write a formula in cell New Stats F3 to determine if all the students are honor students. Display the text all honor students or not everyone is an honor student. Here we have equals and scores F5 to F7. We can do this because F5 through F7 already have a true in them, so we don't have to check it. It's just implied that you're checking for true. Notice where the parentheses are for the and statement. And then the if statement has a parenthesis at the very end. So if the and statement evaluates to true, you're going to display the word all honor students. Otherwise, you're going to display not everyone is an honor student. And again here we're writing a formula in cell New Stats F4 to determine if Led Zeppelin's total score and Rob Thomas's total score is greater than Rascal Flatts' total score. And we're going to display Led and Rob if it's true, or we're going to display Rascal if it's false. And notice again down here we have the and statement, but because the cells have values in them instead of true and false, we have to actually test each cell. Write a formula in cell New Stats F5 to determine if at least one person passed the class. And there we have the same if statement, but now we have an or to check to see if at least one passed the class, and if they did, we will display it. If otherwise, we will display no one passed the class, or no one passed. Here's an example of true and false with the or. The F5 through F7 actually has the words true and false in them. So again, we don't have to say F5 equals true, comma F6 equals true, comma F7 equals true, because it's implied that we're checking to see if F5 equals true. if f6 equals true, if f7 equals true.